After 5 rounds, we finally have our champion. Congratulations to Ireland and commiserations to Scotland for putting up a valiant fight. This game was a lot closer than I personally had anticipated, and I want to dive deeper into what made Scotland so good in the match and how Ireland managed to pull through in the end. Looking at this game overall, we can see that it was an electric yet tactical affair with lots of action. The game saw a total of 349 tackles, most coming from Scotland, and 60 kicks. Both teams really used the width of the field, with 220 passes for Ireland and 132 passes for Scotland, which we'll get to later. From a territorial and possession standpoint though, Ireland completely dominated this game, with 59% territory and 59% possession respectively. Let's start at the beginning of the match. The early part of the game was dominated by Scotland, and it put Ireland under big amounts of pressure. The first few minutes or so also gave us some good insight into how both teams wanted to approach the game. Russell puts the ball deep and into the 15-meter area. Caelan Doris then sets up a nice platform where Ireland can exit from immediately at the next ruck. Instead of letting James Lowe clear with his massive boot like they usually do, Ireland decide to go with a high box kick that is kept in the field of play. Russell then gathers, but under a large amount of pressure and uncomfortably close to the touchline. He is forced to give a wild pass to the inside of the field, which slows down Scotland's counter-attack. When Kinghorn takes the ball up, the Irish defenders are already ahead of his supporting players. This means that he has to attack very wide and offload to Duan van der Merwe. After a brilliant tackle from Badiaki, Scotland's support players are too far away to secure the ball, and it leads to Sheehan winning a penalty. At the lineout that ensues, Scotland managed to disrupt Ireland in the air, which ends up creating messy ball. Ireland do set up an attacking platform, but that disruption gave them enough time to set up a strong defensive line. Ireland then knocked the ball on 2 phases later, and Russell boots the ball as far as he can downfield. This period nearly perfectly depicts how this match went for the other 78 minutes. Ireland wanted to put heaps of pressure on Scotland by trying to suffocate them as much as they could. Scotland, on the other hand, gave Ireland more space to attack and kick from, but they focused on making sure that Ireland would have to create these opportunities from their own half. Let's take this example in the 19th minute of the match. Ireland have been hitting away at the Scottish defence for 10 phases to no avail. Crowley then decides to put the ball through in hopes of pushing Scotland back into their own 5-meter line, but unfortunately for him, the ball goes dead. Now, instead of choosing a scrum just outside the 22, Scotland opt to restart within the 22 instead. Now, it could be that Scotland didn't want to defend an Irish counter-attack directly from the scrum, which is fair, but I do think it shows how much they prioritised the territory game. I think that they didn't want to risk getting turned over at the scrum and chose an ensured kick, even if Ireland were completely set. Russell sends it deep and with a good amount of hang time, which means the Scottish defenders meet Ireland at the halfway line with a solid tackle. This prevents Ireland from getting any momentum, and after 2 phases of solid defensive work, Scotland managed to turn the ball over. Here, instead of looking to attack, Russell immediately puts the ball into a disorganized Irish backfield defense. Ideally, the ball would have stopped before the goal line and put Ireland under even more pressure, but it does ultimately roll into the in-goal area, giving Ireland a goal line restart. This shows how effective this strategy can be if it's executed consistently. In just 1 minute of playtime, Scotland have completely flipped the field position and went from defending their own 22 to receiving from Ireland's try line. This left Ireland with quite a problem, particularly in the early stages of the game, as they were driven back deep into their own half consistently. Instead of playing territorially, they decided to play for pressure and to try and disrupt Scotland in the air. However, Scotland did really well to regather the ball cleanly. In the 3rd minute, Ireland are setting up a box kick with Lowe acting as the first receiver. Scotland are in a 13+2 defence with Blair Kinghorn covering the ball and Kyle Steyn up in the defensive line to act as the blocker. Just before Gibson Park exits, Lowe transitions from the first receiver role to the chaser. Ben White and Steyn do really well to block Lowe's chase, and it gives Kinghorn a pressure-free take in the air. The next few phases are really interesting. Scotland set up a box kick of their own, and Ireland regather on the side of the field. They then put up a pod in the 15-meter for a better kicking angle with Lowe once again in the pocket. This time, however, Lowe acts as the kicker, but gets charged down by Christie, who shoots up aggressively. This might seem like a small detail, but I think it's an important one. Scotland was able to deal with a strong aspect to Ireland's exit strategy. Because James Lowe has such a great boot on him and is good in the air, it means that Ireland have lots of options at their exits. He can act as both a chaser and a kicker and be effective at both. On the flip side, Ireland did deal with this early pressure effectively and prevented Scotland from getting a try, even when they had good attacking platforms. Ireland's defence was equally as good in this match. One of the main features of their defensive system is the pressure that they put on teams at the breakdown. They focus on getting off the line quickly and then creating disruptions for the team on the ground. We can see that Ireland uses the 13+2 defence in open play with a more narrow setup and the wingers staying back. This allows for more double hits, and should the ball carrier get to the outside of the line, then the winger will shoot up to cover, and the other defenders will drift strongly. Just like Ireland, Scotland attacked very wide in the game, but they put a focus on ball continuity instead of high-risk plays. Against Italy the week before, Scotland focused on keeping the ball alive a lot more by making more offloads. Against Ireland, however, they focused on protecting the ball more and having more control. If we look at these pods, we can see that the players within the pods stand closer together, and the ball carrier tucks the ball under his arm way before he makes contact with the defence. Now, this doesn't mean that they were keeping their overall structure tight. They still spread the ball across the pitch. These wider attacks from Scotland also left their attackers more exposed at times, and given that Ireland have some of the best tacklers in their pack, it's no wonder that the Scots were turned over many times. On the flip side, Scotland put in a massive defensive effort. Before we get to the defensive line, I want to focus on an area that is perhaps not being focused on enough. That being, Scotland managed to take a core strength away from this Irish team, and that is the line-out. In the 12th minute of the game, we can see how well they did their homework. Ireland have a line-out 5 meters from the Scottish try line. Ireland then go to the front to set up with a maul before running a strike move on the blind side. Scotland react quickly enough and ultimately bundles Sheehan into touch. Everyone knows how ridiculously effective these quick attacks from the line-out are for Ireland, so this is really impressive defence. This is really the smart work of Andy Christie, who had an absolutely excellent game, by the way. The idea here is that Ireland want to draw both Christie and White when McCarthy and Furlong peel around. This makes logical sense, as a lock and tight head is a big mismatch against a scrum half and flanker. When McCarthy then passes, this would create another mismatch with Sheehan against Van der Merwe. However, notice when peeling around to defend, Christie stays about a meter back to assess the attack properly. Also notice how his hips are pointed towards the touchline instead of towards McCarthy and Furlong. This is such an important detail and probably the reason why this defense worked. If McCarthy passes to Sheehan, then he wouldn't need to change direction and he would have enough speed to cover the outside. If McCarthy passes to Furlong, then Christie would have to change direction. Yes, but remember that he's a meter back, and it would give him enough time to plant his feet and make a try-saving tackle. Unfortunately, this defence was undone at the very next line-out, as Scotland gifted a try to Sheehan with an overthrow. Scotland also managed to defend Ireland's strike moves effectively. Here, Ireland are looking to break the line just before half-time to go into the break with their tails up. They want to run a double blocker play here, meaning that they want to create two areas of deception and, given the space, a high chance of a line break. However, there are two reasons why this didn't work. The first is that when we look at the inside of the field, not enough Scottish players are drawn into uncertainty. The ball gets passed to Doris, but Furlong is not in a position to receive the offload. This means that both Christie and Turner can drift strongly without any threat to the inside. But if we look deeper, then James Lowe is also not really a threat. The person who would be covering Lowe here would be Ferguson, which would be a big mismatch. In essence, instead of turning hips towards the inside of the field, all Scottish defenders' hips are turned to the outside and they can drift strongly across. The second reason is that we can see Scotland taking a more conservative approach to the defence. This attack has a lot of moving parts, which inherently means that they need to attack with more depth. This would theoretically give Scotland an opportunity to press up aggressively. But the Scottish line only meets the Irish a few meters beyond the gain line, and this ensures very strong connections between defenders. With a strong drift and strong connections, it meant that even with all these threats and uncertainties, Scotland was able to deal with this attack quite comfortably. Not only that, but at the very next ruck, the Scottish defensive line is strong once again. Over the next few phases, Ireland only managed to advance 10 meters upfield before knocking it on. Ireland did, however, attack strongly overall. As mentioned before, they made a lot of passes and shifted the ball to the outside a lot, and we can see this in this example just after half-time. Scotland box kick deep and Lama regathers. He immediately looks to attack the middle of the field. Notice how wide Byrne is in support, with Sheehan's hips pointing towards him. It's clear here that the idea is to shift the ball as wide as they can. Scotland don't compete at the next breakdown and is forced to fold over. This gives Ireland lightning quick ruck speed, and they shift it to Lowe on the edge, who breaks down the touchline and offloads to Aki. The next ruck, Ireland run a tight pod with the hopes of putting strain on Scotland's outside defenders. Porter then gives it to Crowley, who gives a skip pass as fast as he can to Omani, who in turn drives into the 22 as Ben White and Kyle Steyn are forced to cover the pod. This is because the Scottish forwards are all covering that narrow pod that Ireland set up in the beginning of the phase. Scotland do well to set their defensive line from here, but they are under huge amounts of strain, and a few phases later they gave away a penalty, leading to a 10-6 lead to Ireland. But let's be honest, when we think back at this match, what probably comes to mind are these epic defensive sets that Scotland did to hold out against an unbelievably strong attack. Let's take a look at an example in the 58th minute. Ireland have a line-out on Scotland's 5-meter line, and they set up a maul in the front of the line-out. Now, we don't have too much time to go into detail here, but see how Scotland isn't competing at the maul? Also, when the maul sets, notice how Scotland drives to the side of the field instead of driving Ireland backwards. The idea here for Scotland is that they want to dominate the initial hit, and they don't want Ireland to set a strong driving maul. The reason they are driving to the touchline is because they want to move the maul away from the Irish support players. If the maul was at the back of the line-out, then they would be driving to the inside of the field, and if it was in the middle, they would be looking to drive it backwards. Anyways, Ireland set up a strong maul regardless, and starts creeping forward. Scotland then wheels the maul, meaning they try to spin it, to cause the Irish forwards to lose their feet and to disrupt the ball, which is successful. See how number 17 and number 4 for Scotland pulls out Porter. These players were responsible for the disruption. Ireland then breaks off from the maul and gets very close to the try line. After 6 pick and goes, Ireland still don't manage to get a try, and even when going wide, they still don't get closer. After another ruck, they knock the ball on and give Scotland some breathing room. So how the hell did Scotland prevent a try there? Well, there are 2 parts to this. The first is how they prevented these pick and goes from gaining ground. See how the Scottish defenders bind to each other right next to the ruck on both sides? This gives them a large amount of power when driving Ireland back, and makes it nigh on impossible for Ireland's forwards to drive over the line with power alone. Now the caveat to this is that it makes Scotland's defence extremely narrow. When we look at the rest of the field, we can see that there is a very large amount of space across the pitch for Ireland to exploit. The second part to this is that Scotland's outside defender have one mission, and that's to disrupt the attack in the middle of the field at all costs. In this instance, Scotland switches to a very strong blitz. A smaller detail on how Ireland tried to get around this is that instead of Gibson Park passing from the base of the ruck, he would receive a pop pass from the ruck instead, and then distribute it to the side. Another important piece that really helped Scotland throughout the match is that they were able to focus on a lot of double tackles. While they weren't able to make many turnovers here, it did give them those vital few seconds that they needed to set their defensive lines. There are a few more key areas that I want to mention briefly, and that is that Ireland had the more dominant scrum, and it gave them many platforms throughout the match. Scotland were also able to telegraph some of Ireland's more intricate attacking moves in open play. Like here, we've seen many of these inside balls to players break the line, but Scotland stays square enough that their connections remain strong and they complete the tackle. This was a great championship decider, and I think both teams will be happy with how they played. Ireland's tour of South Africa in July looks mouth-watering though, as the Six Nations champions will take on the world champions.